Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. This is Mark Drosh with Interactive Services. And today, we continue our series of webinars that run for about 40 minutes. We do these every 6 weeks, where we have a chat about compliance and ethics training. Today, we're going to have interviews with two people. We're lucky to be joined by Nicole Harris, who is with LinkedIn, and will be the main feature. No pressure, Nicole, for the presentation, when we'll be talking about running a successful ethics and compliance training program at an international tech company. Also, we're joined by Paddy McGovern. Paddy is based in our head office in Dublin, Ireland. Probably not as good weather as Nicole is getting on the West Coast, but Paddy heads up content for our compliance offering, and recently was published an article that outlined some recommendations for making effective compliance training within a technology company. So we'd love to hear from Paddy and just talk about some of the insights that went behind that paper, and we'll also give you an opportunity to access it afterwards if need be. The session itself, as I mentioned, will run for about 40 minutes with our two speakers. And at any time, if you wanted to send in a question for our panelists, the session is being hosted by Neil Cullen, who many of you will be familiar with, and as we get any questions, we'll field them to our panelists at the end of the session. So by all means, send them in, and then as we get time, we'll allow a quick 10 minutes for Q&A at the end there. Lovely. Well, why don't we get kicked off? And before we do that, I'll just give a very quick overview of who Interactive Services is for anybody that hasn't met our firm before. Interactive Services has been around for about 24 years now, and historically we've built learning programs for big global brands that have ranged from Citi to Walmart to pharmaceutical leaders. About 2 years ago, we made a heavy push into the compliance space and launched ICT, or the Interactive Compliance Training, which is a library of over 80 ready-made e-learning topics designed to address core compliance at a major organization, whether you're domestic to the US or run an international business. Training is available in multiple languages. It's been built to add your own screens. We update it annually, and it should play on just about any mobile device. You'll see on the next screen the topics that we are currently offering. There's over 80 of those. They're all about 5 minutes long. For any of you that are joining us from California, given that this is a tech discussion, we do cover AB 1825 through some of our anti-harassment and workplace conduct, and then our special California expansion pack. So with that out of the way, why don't we kick off and dive straight into the first part of the presentation, where I'd like to take a few moments to speak with Paddy McGovern, who recently wrote an article, as I said, around compliance training and what makes it particularly effective at technology companies. Paddy, to kick us off, why do you think compliance training is such a challenge to get right at tech firms versus other big international companies?
Well, I think in general, compliance training does have the reputation of being, dull or being a chore. I mean, if you're a regular employee at any company, tech firms included, when you get that email or that notification that your annual compliance training is due, the normal reaction is, oh my God, that's another 2-4 hours I have to take out of my week to do training I feel I only did 6 months ago. And I think that's even more pronounced in tech companies, because tech companies are renowned for being so innovative, and a lot of compliance training tends to lag behind. So in many cases with tech audiences, you're nearly behind the 8 ball before you even start with your compliance training.
Lovely. I know that the article, which we can provide access to from our website afterwards. Neil, actually, if you want to just show where it is so that folks have got some reference, that would be super. Yep. So on our homepage there, you have to remind me where this is, Neil.
Yeah, so if we go into the About Us section on the website and go into our learning resources, there will be a section, and it's actually just down on the very bottom of that page. So there's a quick introductory description there, and then if I click on the image, that will launch.
Lovely. And there's no password restrictions. Anybody can get to this article, right?
Exactly, yeah, that's available publicly for everybody.
Lovely. Fantastic. Well, you're more than welcome to read that in your own time, but now while we have Paddy on the line, let's just talk about the 5 design tips that were at the backbone of the article. Paddy, I mean, the first one was about grabbing learners' attention right from the start. Do you want to just share a couple of ideas as to how you go about doing that and why it's important?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel really that how you grab their learner's attention is a twofold task, and you really start that before they even launch any of your training, and that's in your communication strategy. So if you have an effective communication strategy that can generate a little bit of buzz or excitement about the upcoming compliance training, you're really setting yourself up for your compliance training to succeed. So that might be just by distributing a little video vignette that references a recent news story related to a compliance breach in the tech sector, something like that. And then once you get into your training, I mean, it's key to engage the learner early, because we really want their reaction to be, wow, this isn't what compliance training is normally like. This is different. This might actually be interesting. And if you can do that within the first 2 minutes, you a good chance of hooking the learner and getting them to engage with your training. And then as you move through the training, you can use storytelling and conceptual imagery, animated videos. You give the learner control of the order in which they view the content. And also a key one then as well, especially in the tech industry, is like, if you can make your training not look like traditional e-learning and maybe look more like akin to a website, that's a really good way of engaging learners and getting the point across that the training is a little bit different and it's something new for them.
And today we won't actually demo any of the programs we've rolled out in the tech industry, but if anyone wants to have a look at some of those afterwards, by all means, either reach out to myself or Neil. Paddy, would you mind, or to Neil, would you mind moving on to the second point here? Scenarios, they're a backbone of any effective compliance and ethics training program. What do you think makes a good scenario for a tech worker?
Well, I think the key to any scenario is making it realistic for the learner. So the learner has to be able to picture themselves in that actual scenario. So if it's something that's completely unrelatable to them, they're going to switch off immediately. So in the compliance sector, there's a lot of areas that might be considered quite generic. So harassment in an office environment. A lot of scenarios around that can be quite generic, but you can take that and lend a little technology specific element to it. Say if you take a harassment scenario and you set it at a tech conference, maybe the employees are at a tech conference, they're gone out for drinks afterwards, someone says something that they think is just harmless fun, someone else perceives it in a completely different way, and in that type of way you're kind of relating it to your audience. In the tech sector, you might have a younger type of audience that would be in those type of situations, and I think that's the key to making a scenario relevant for a learner, is setting in an environment that they're used to, and also making the scenario something that they can relate to.
Fantastic, really useful. Neil, do you want to move us on to point number 3? Gamification. It's been the buzzword within the learning industry for the past couple of years. I guess the message here, when I read your notes beforehand, was just proceed with caution. Tell us a little bit about gamification and what you see its role being in teaching compliance for tech industry.
Yeah. So I suppose when we talk about gamification in relation to our compliance training, we're not really talking about games that can encourage learning, because that, a lot of people in the compliance sector, and it's a very valid point, would find games a little bit frivolous to teach, anti-bribery, anti-corruption, anti-harassment. So when we talk about gamification, we're really talking about a learning experience that feels like a game. So that's really taking an element maybe like an assessment and including a little scoring mechanism with it, so that you're challenging the learners in a little bit of a way, and especially for tech sector employees, that little bit of a gamification element, the little bit of a challenge for them can engage them a little bit more, and challenge them in a way that's going to make them interact a little bit more with the training and engage with it. Once you've captured their attention from your first 2 minutes, keep them engaged throughout the training.
I think it's a very valid point. I mean, if you look at the budget for the modern video game production now, I mean, they're running into millions. They're getting up there with blockbuster Hollywood films. You're unlikely to have that budget, even with the best will in the world, for your compliance training. So, if you do something, it's best to do it well. So I think this idea of applying simple elements of gamification is definitely one that I would get behind. Neil, do you want to move on to point 4? We touched on this a little bit before, Neil, as Paddy, when we talked about the scenarios, but relevance really is something that we preach throughout our entire compliance learning experience. What does that mean in terms of relevance when it comes to the technology industry?
Well, it's building on those scenarios that might be technology specific, and actually then embedding your policies, your lingo, your hotlines, etc. within the training, so that you're adding your voice and message and identity to what might otherwise be considered generic type training. So that's really a key element, is taking the training and giving it your own brand, so that learners not only engage with it, but they identify with it as being part of your corporate culture.
Fantastic. Well, Paddy, we'll wrap up on our final point here, and I really want to hear from Nicole as well. But just to end these short bullets, talk a little bit about design and making it intuitive when we think about online learning for compliance.
Yeah, well, I think I could kind of touch on this a little bit at the very start, and that's one of the ways to engage learners is move away from the traditional type of e-learning and give them something that maybe looks a little bit more like a web page, which is really vital for when it comes to engaging tech sector employees. So if you have a fresh, intuitive, interesting design for them, you're relying on them to navigate it. Nearly everyone in the tech sector is familiar with navigating web pages, etc. So by giving them the opportunity to interact with something that's a little bit different from the traditional e-learning, you get their buy-in a little bit more as well, and you get to their making a good first impression when the training opens, that it's different. They haven't seen anything like this before. I've never been able to take my training on my smartphone before. I've never been able to take it on my tablet before. This looks really cool on a tablet. It's really different to what I've done in the past.
That's fantastic, Paddy. We really appreciate it. And if you don't mind, if you could just hang around with us for another 20 minutes, we might have some questions at the end, and your expertise would be great to have part of the discussion.
Sure, no problem.
From here, I'd like to move on and introduce our main guest, Nicole Harris, who'll be joining us from LinkedIn. And you're in the San Francisco Bay Area this morning, correct, Nicole?
That's right. I'm out here live in Sunnyvale.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate you taking a bit of time to talk about your own experiences. I know you said before that you moved from finance into tech, so it'd be interesting to hear how the two compared. But to kick us off, compliance training means so many different things to different companies. The resources are available, the goals, where you sit within the organization, it can vary so much. Tell us a little bit about the role that you play at LinkedIn and what compliance training means to your firm.
Sure. So perhaps like a lot of other tech companies, LinkedIn has a fairly young compliance program, just about 3 years old at this point. And there are only 3 of us on this mighty team. So you end up becoming a little bit of a jack of all trades as far as compliance is concerned. So from my perspective, I run our global compliance training and communications efforts. That includes kind of a mix of creating the training myself and also implementing training through our vendors. All of our communications efforts related to training or otherwise. I'm also responsible for all of our conflict of interest disclosures, written standards, policies, code of conduct, and really anything else that comes my way, which, as I'm sure everybody can relate, can really run the gamut out here.
Sounds like quite a broad spectrum of responsibilities with a lot of different policies and such areas all coming together. To get us kicked off, and maybe you can start with the most interesting area for me. How do you make training culturally relevant? I mean, I know culture is so important within tech firms, and also if we're going to create effective compliance training, it really needs to impact the culture of business. Can you just tell me how you make that relevant to a tech firm based upon your experiences?
Sure. So I think cultural relevance is a continued challenge in all organizations, right? But there's added pressure, I think, in the tech space because tech companies thrive on innovation and attracting top talent to kind of fuel that innovation, right? So I think you need to look at relevance through 2 lenses. relevance to cultural relevance within the company and cultural relevance within the broader space. And so I think, you know, you need to have training that makes sense for your company. So you're leveraging, a lot of companies have values and cultural language already embedded in the business that people believe in, that's well disseminated, that's familiar to them. And I think that you can leverage a lot of that language as part of your training, not just to sort of help them operationalize some of these values and cultural tenets, but to really help communicate why it's important, right? Because I think one of the main issues that you're going to see in tech specifically, and especially as you have an increasingly millennial learning demographic, is that people are going to kind of push back on things that aren't relevant, that maybe they don't understand why this is important to their specific job function. Maybe they see it as something that's kind of inhibiting them from meeting their business goals, engineering deadlines, things like that. So I think that you really have to be sort of sensitive to the fact, you know, that people want something that is going to be efficient for them, that equips them with the knowledge they need to just be able to do their job, helps them to build or sell the company's products in a way that's ethical, and that generally just doesn't slow them down or negatively impact business goals. And I think that's going to be universally relevant no matter how you end up packaging the training. And then further, when you're kind of looking at cultural relevance on a broader scale, you know, I think it's important to make sure that your training isn't dated, that you're using a fresh and modern aesthetic. And as Patty had mentioned, you're using scenarios that are relevant to your business. And especially as new and emerging risks kind of appear as you're working with the business, you know, incorporating that into your training moving forward. So constantly kind of updating and making sure that all of the content is relevant to the business and feels like it was built, you know, in the year that the person is taking it, versus some of these throwbacks to traditional e-learning courses that maybe look like they came from 1996, because you're going to get people turning off immediately when they see that.
I think there's some great insights there. I mean, I especially like the idea of thinking about something that's relevant to the tech sector overall, the nuances of that, the population, and then going one step further and thinking about the firm itself. One of the areas that you mentioned there was millennial workers, and whilst I appreciate, you know, within software, there's probably some engineers now that are coming to the end of their careers and have worked a full career in technology now, but the industry certainly is known for its millennial population and being an exciting place to work. How do you go about engaging that millennial audience specifically and making sure that they have a positive first experience when they may come in and join, could be their first job, and have to sit through a piece of compliance training for the first time?
Absolutely. I think it's important not to treat the millennial population like some, you know, sort of mythical, finicky beast that needs to be tamed, because I do think that can be a pitfall, right? It's important to engage your millennial population, but I think what's interesting, and in my experience with our millennial learning population, is that they're just more comfortable being the mouthpiece for what everybody else is thinking. And my inbox is a testament to that, right? If there's a training or part of a training that they think is cheesy, that is not moving as quickly as they'd like it to, they have no problem reaching out to me or directly to my VP and saying, this is stupid, why am I doing this? And they'll be blunt with you. And so I think that it's really important to solicit that kind of feedback and listen to it, because one of the things that I've heard a lot directly from our millennial population, you know, is that video elements, for example, if there's any sort of hitch or delay when they're trying to launch a video as part of the training, they're done. They're not going to put up with it. So any video elements or any other interactivity that you have needs to be short and seamless. You need to have references, again, that are current and relevant. You need to have dialogue and, I think, language and communicate the core tenets of the training in a way that's reflective of how people communicate in their day-to-day. And I think any attempts at humor, I think, need to be well-timed and subtle, because you also have a population that's really sensitive to material that's cheesy, frankly, and they have no problem telling me when they think my jokes are bad. So I think you just really have to steel yourself for that feedback and take it, because this is, I think, one of the defining factors that we look at for the millennial population, right, is that they're a little bit more fearless about speaking their mind and giving their opinion. And I think a lot of tech companies probably have the same sort of dynamic there. And I think generally, nobody likes taking hours and hours of training, especially if it's boring and flat and very basic. So again, kind of working to make it culturally relevant, making an effort to have a clean aesthetic, something that's modern, and something that's a good use of people's time, I think is a solid way to get millennial buy-in.
I guess that unsolicited feedback is probably a mixed blessing. I've never heard of a major financial institution receiving feedback unless they've specifically asked for it. So that's a pretty unique situation. And I'm guessing on the cheese factor, probably no teleprompter videos of people against bad green screen footage either.
Yeah.
What role do your senior leaders play in your compliance programs, both in what you push out on online and then any events that run throughout the business? Just tell us a little bit overall about the role that stakeholders play in the ecosystem.
Sure. Well, it's funny that you mentioned finance and other sort of highly regulated industries, because I think there is, in my experience, a clear sort of division in the perception of compliance and ethics, depending on the sphere in which you're operating. And so I think when you work for a tech company, you maybe don't have quite as much leverage as you would in healthcare or finance, for example. And so a lot of times our execs, I don't want to say that they don't find compliance to be important, but again, there's sort of this perception that compliance and ethics slows the business down, and legal generally, right? Legal matters will slow the company down when we're really trying to innovate. And so I think that for us, when we're trying to engage our exec leaders in some of these training and communications efforts, we really have to start at the outset and think about, what does our CEO communicate? Our CEO is really passionate about our culture and values. So how are we creating a training that is both in line with our culture and values, makes it clear to the learners taking this training that by taking the course, they're actually going to learn how to operationalize some core aspects of our value propositions, and then presenting that, to our C-suite and saying, look, this is what we've created. This is what we'd like you to say about it. So getting their buy-in by basically leveraging the language and the values that are already important to them. And then that way we can kind of create a communication campaign around this that is going to sound familiar to employees, that already aligns with other initiatives we've got going on at the top of the organization. And that's something that we can build into the modules themselves. We've done, videos with our GC and our CEO. We've done an animated version of our CEO for one of our trainings, and we've repurposed some of these like character renderings for some of our comms efforts. So that kind of ties everything together in this more cohesive narrative. And I feel like that's been the most successful formula for us in making sure we get that exec level buy-in consistently, and that it actually makes sense and feels sincere when an employee is viewing all of this together.
Could you run through some of the elements that make up that overall communication awareness campaign? You touched on a couple of the pieces that get pushed out, but it'd be lovely to hear how they're sequenced, how they back each other up, and if there's anything you feel have been particularly successful.
Definitely. I feel really strongly that the way you communicate the training and the frequency with which you communicate the importance of taking the training is really just as important as the training itself, right? So this is something that I work closely with our VP on throughout the year. We craft personalized announcements directly from him. We don't send anything that comes from a faceless generic compliance inbox. It all comes directly from him. And again, that's where we start to see a lot of the feedback specifically from our millennial population, who have no fear about just replying to him directly and saying, no, I don't want to do this. So that's good for getting engagement. It's not obviously sustainable over the long run for answering 10,000 separate questions, but it does give a personal touch to it. So it's really important. One of the things we always do is make sure that one of us is issuing this communication directly, and we do it consistently. We leverage some of our internal resources, whether it is our digital display boards throughout the company. We have our own company group on LinkedIn, typically reserved for our employees complaining about the saltiness of the food in the cafeteria, for example. Okay. But also a really good place for us to say, hey guys, it's end of quarter is coming up. Remember, there's this training based on our trading windows. Here's a cool article that, we link back to that kind of brings this all together. So we try to bring it all full circle as part of this broader compliance conversation that isn't just us, peppering people with training reminders, which we do fairly often, but we try to reinforce that by making compliance more of a casual discussion that's consistently seen throughout the company. And I think we're really fortunate at LinkedIn because, as I've said, we have a really strong culture and value statements that are embraced pretty universally across the company. And I think that we can easily leverage that in our training and comms efforts. And again, once you kind of take some of that values language, you don't need to create your own separate culture of compliance with its own, dictionary of compliance cultural terms. You can really leverage what is already there and put a compliance spin on it and show people how to sort of put those values to practical use in their day-to-day. We can all say, act with integrity, act like an owner, but we're not always showing employees what that looks like. And so when we take the opportunity through our communications efforts and through our broader training efforts to kind of show people what that looks like, we tend to get a lot more engagement. And it just ends up being more of a meaningful experience versus just a sort of check-the-box routine.
Well, it sounds like a very mature program, especially given that you've only been up and running for 3 years. It's cohesive, it's integrated, clear goals, the program. To wrap up, what's next for LinkedIn in terms of where you're taking your compliance training next? And then Neil, from there, if it's okay, we'll go to you for questions.
What is next is a great question. I'm sure, as everybody probably knows, LinkedIn has been acquired by Microsoft, who in their own right do a lot of really cool and innovative things on the training front. So I think our hope is to kind of figure out where the middle ground is there and deliver training that's still relevant to a LinkedIn learning population and continue to kind of refine our training efforts there. I think it's nice that it sounds very cohesive, but of course behind the scenes, as I'm sure many people can sympathize with, it feels like constantly running from crisis to crisis. So it would be lovely to have everything sort of seamlessly integrated and all running properly and functionally and not having any fires to put out. But it's a continued challenge. So I think just kind of making sure that we have a consistent schedule and plan both for annual compliance training, new hire compliance training, and any other ad hoc training that we need to do for specific employee populations, and making sure that we're on a good schedule to get all of that content updated so that it's relevant. I mean, that's really important to keep something relevant. You can't just create it once and then let it sit there. So it really is a constant challenge to kind of balance what we already have and what we've worked hard to create and what really still resonates within the business and within the world.
Well, Nicole, thank you for being so generous in what you've shared today. I mean, it's rare that we get to hear from other companies that can be siloed within our own firms. So it's taken me 15 to 20 minutes to hear about what you're doing and sort of some of the challenges that you alluded to there. It's been really useful. I'm sure you'll probably have got a couple of questions. But Neil, do you want to just lead the Q&A piece and let us know who you'd like to take the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a question from Mike regarding appealing to international employees. So Nicole, you spoke of company culture and culture that's specific to LinkedIn, and just maybe to touch on how that translates internationally from your US office locations to the international office locations as well.
Sure, that is another ongoing challenge. And again, I think we're fortunate that our global population is not shy about speaking up when they feel that something, of course, is US-centric. We do our best to make sure there's no sort of cultural references or anything that feels too US-based. But that being said, there's different perceptions of the company and the culture depending on where you are, right? There's a lot more sense, for example, in the Bay Area, right, of us being, really excited about the company and having the company as part of our identity. Whereas, some of our peers in Dublin, for example, have said, yeah, we don't really view it that way. So I think it's constantly a challenge, and it's difficult to scale as well. But one of the things that we try to do, we travel quite frequently to our international offices, get a sense for not only what the offices look like, but what the culture is there and what specific issues are facing our people out there, because they do vary depending on where you're doing business and what business you're doing. So we do make an effort to make sure that the imagery, any animation that we do, we're reflective of our diversity, inclusion, and belonging efforts as well. We're using a variety of locations. We're using, different voiceover artists who aren't just, standard American-sounding robots, and just constantly soliciting feedback from the business about, what challenges they're facing and what we can do to make the training most relevant for them. So it's still a work in progress, but I think constantly trying to put your finger on the pulse of sort of the international learning audience is really important for shaping the training as you move forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Nicole. And Mark, maybe one for you. We did touch on this when, on the question relating to including senior stakeholders and getting their buy-in, but Effie has a question asking about the number of resources needed to truly manage compliance training effectively, and then how we sell, having those resources to senior leaders.
Wow, why didn't you give that question to Nicole or Paddy? It's a tricky one. I think it varies so much from organization to organization, and it's not always related to headcount. I think we've seen programs that have been run very efficiently by micro teams, like Nicole mentioned there, where they've got a very strong objective. There's a clear direction overall from the business of where they want to go, and employees are empowered to lead that compliance program and make it happen. The other end of the spectrum is working with a large international pharmaceutical company where we overhaul their code of ethics program, and literally they had 30 stakeholders either in the room or joining by video conference call, each with their own piece of training that was just as important as their peers. And it was the first time that they brought that large group together, but it was so critical for running an effective program so that it was cohesive and timely. Otherwise, they were looking at about 10 to 12 hours of training, and we worked with them to get it down to 90 minutes. So I think it can vary. At a minimum, I think what you want to aim for is to allocate one, possibly two people at a minimum who work full time on your compliance training, and then have a spoke model where you reach out to stakeholders, engage them, but they have a very clear role to play in the program and managing its effectiveness. That's the best answer I can give for you, Neil, without saying how long's a piece of string, but hopefully there's some actionable items from what we've seen. Maybe we want to just go with one very quick last question, then we can wrap up pretty much on the time as we planned.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Mark. Thanks. And Paddy, I might go to you for this one, if that's okay. So, for companies that might have a slightly more conservative company culture, or may not have as much of an opportunity to be creative when it comes to their compliance training, do you have any tips or ideas that people can, implement simply that might address that?
So are we, I suppose, address it from the perspective, Neil, of the requirement that the training isn't. Sorry, could you run that one by me again, Neil?
Yeah, sure.
Paddy, go ahead, please.
Oh, go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
So I think for firms that are maybe having to take those small baby steps, and can't go off and do cartoons of their CEO, like Nicole, what are some of the small things we can start off with for companies that are maybe a little bit more conservative and set in how they do their way?
Well, I think one of the key things, and we spoke about it earlier, is engage in your audience. And one thing that seems to go across very well with multiple different audience levels, from conservative to the more tech savvy people, is you get a little open and animated video. We're not talking about a character animation or anything like that, but you're talking about imagery and little pieces of video building in time with audio and text, and kinetic type text that really sell your message up front, especially if you're coming from a conservative type environment where the training might traditionally be not as engaging as you'd normally like to see. That those little types of videos up front can really pique a learner's interest and engage them from the off, and get you over a hurdle of where learners are very reluctant to take your compliance training. You can set off, put the best foot forward and get them engaged from the off with a little video that really just 90 seconds that really sells the concept you're talking about. So it might be anti-bribery and corruption, the importance of anti-bribery and corruption, the consequences around breaches, that sort of thing. Does that sort of answer the question, Neil?
That's fantastic, Paddy. It's definitely what we were looking for there. Neil, if it's okay from here, we'll wrap up. I want to try and keep these sessions timely so we get people continue to come back for them. Maybe if you just share here what happens next on the next slide, I can walk through this and then I can wrap up the session for us. So what happens next? Neil will send out a copy of the deck to all participants. We'll include a link to the article that Paddy mentioned there. You can see some of the examples of what we talked about in terms of intuitive design on our website. But perhaps most importantly, and hopefully it'll be okay for me to say this, Nicole, if anybody wants to reach out to you on LinkedIn and stay in touch, a lot of the meat of the presentation today really came from your own insights and what you shared on the phone. So we're hoping it's just the start of a dialogue.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. But beyond that, if you have any specific requests, there's Neil, our colleague Jennifer Benson, and myself. We're all here to help with any questions that you might have. But beyond that, I'd really like to thank Paddy and Nicole for joining us today. You both did a super job. Paddy, you gave us some good theoretical backgrounds there from structural design, and then Nicole, thank you so much for sharing what it's like to be at the coalface and some real stories of what's happening in within a big technology company that we're all familiar with. It was a really useful session. Thank you so much.